Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Leah Rodler, and I'm a Community Development Officer with the Community Development Unit with Alberta Culture and Status of Women. I will be one of your presenters today, and I'm joined by my colleagues Anne Davidson, Executive Director of the Community Engagement Branch, and Dwayne Van Babel, Senior Manager, Organizational Development Stream, who you'll hear from in just a few minutes. We also have on the line our colleagues Sherry and Justin, who are supporting the tech end of things today. So if you do have questions, you can send them a direct chat and they should be able to help you out if there's any problem with the tech or that kind of thing. We are taking questions throughout today, so pop them in the chat and Sherry's going to kind of compile them for us, and at the end of presentation we will get to as many of those questions as possible, so please don't hesitate to pop them in there as we go through so that you don't miss something or forget about it as we continue down. But before we begin and dig into the content, in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, truth, we honor and acknowledge that we are on traditional territories in Alberta of the many First Nation and Métis and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. Today, I myself am joining you from the traditional Treaty 7 territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and it is the home to the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, as well as the Nakota and the Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that this territory is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. So before we dig into the content, we do have a brief message from the Honourable Minister of Culture that we'd like to share with you.
Hello, I'm Ron Orr, Minister of Culture. Thank you for attending today's Freedom to Care Act webinar. Nonprofits play a key role in Alberta's economic, social, and emotional recovery. The Freedom to Care Act aims to remove industry-focused barriers for nonprofits and support their role in the delivery of important programs and services. The Act and its program does this in two ways. First, it makes it easier for nonprofits to navigate existing regulatory exemptions. And second, it provides liability protection for volunteers who contribute so much in building and strengthening our communities. We recently launched the Freedom to Care website to help nonprofits identify and access existing regulatory exemptions or apply for new ones if needed. It also provides information and resources regarding volunteer protections and includes resources for best practices in volunteer management and a volunteer checklist. Having this information on one convenient website makes it easier for nonprofits and their volunteers to focus on what they do best, helping Albertans. I encourage you to explore the website and share it with your colleagues. At its heart, the Freedom to Care Act empowers the sector by providing more support to address community needs. We see the incredible power of our nonprofits as they continue to serve and help write the next great chapter in Alberta's story. Thank you to all those who provided their valuable input in the development of the Freedom to Care Act and for your dedication to making life better for all Albertans.
All right, so the purpose of today's presentation is to really provide you an overview of what the Freedom to Care Act and the associated government programming do, and to demonstrate some of the tools and resources that are available to you on the website. The information that we're going to present today is at an introductory level, and with that said, the information is presented and the related materials are not intended to constitute legal advice, the rendering of legal concepts, consulting, or professional services of any kind. We simply want to share information with you that we think will be helpful as you navigate your organization through its operations. And on that note, none of us here today presenting are judges or lawyers or insurance professionals, and we cannot provide interpretation or advice about your specific scenarios or situations. For your own organization-specific situations related to the material that we present, you may need to seek the advice from a professional in that related area. And again, I will share for those who may be coming late. If you do have questions or comments throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will do our best to get to them at the end of the presentation. And we will hopefully hit all of those once we're done. So yes, and now I'd like to hand it off to Anne, who's going to give us a bit of a walkthrough of the purpose and intent.
Thank you, Leah. So first off, I would like to say a huge thank you for everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We do hope that you find the session informative. And again, as Leah said, we're happy to take whatever questions that you might have. So freedom to care, I'll just kind of provide a quick overview in terms of the purpose and speak to a little bit in terms of why now. So Bill 58, the Freedom to Care Act, was introduced into the legislature by Minister Ahir on March 23rd. It was passed on June 16th and received royal assent on June 17th. The act came into effect on September 1st, so it's only been in effect for the last couple of months. The purpose of the act, so the intent of the act, as well as the associated resources and processes to support its implementation, is to remove barriers for Alberta's nonprofit and charitable organizations in performing social good, while further demonstrating government's commitment to support the sector and encourage volunteers. The Freedom to Care Act includes two key elements, and again, intended to reduce barriers for nonprofit organizations and individual volunteers in delivering service to Albertans. So the first part is the volunteer liability protection. Again, it introduces broad liability protection for volunteers that are acting within the scope of their responsibilities. And it's that protection is to ensure that individual volunteers that are working on behalf of a nonprofit are not personally held liable, again, as long as they're acting within the scope of their duties, and there isn't any intent or willful either criminal misconduct or to cause harm to individuals. The second part of it is the exemptions to regulations. And again, it really is intended to make it easier for nonprofits to be able to identify what are those existing exemptions that already apply to regulations. And then the second part is create a process for nonprofits to request one-time exemptions. And what the Act does, it actually provides authority to Cabinet to be able to grant those one-time exemptions. And we have a process now in order to do that. So many may be asking kind of why now. I think, just a little bit in terms of the nonprofit sector is that we know that the nonprofit volunteer sector touches virtually all aspects of community life. The sector consists of over 26,000 nonprofits, from small organizations to large, and from that diversity of, it may be sport or arts or community, it could be faith-based, it could be around health or education or social services, organizations that support seniors or newcoming. So again, that wide diversity of our nonprofit. The sector also generates 5.5 billion in GDP annually. So again, it is an economic driver for the province. And we know that 1.6 million Albertans contribute more than 262 million volunteer hours a year to support the sector. And that the sector provides both emergent as well as ongoing supports to Albertans. So again, we recognize the important role that the sector plays in community. With respect to the volunteer liability, some of the why now, government has made a commitment to harness the power of civil society. There is the recognition that voluntary work is a fundamental building block of civil society and contributes significantly in terms of the quality of life that we experience here in Alberta. Volunteers also contribute in terms of or contributions provide that economic benefit. That volunteers' efforts to help meet the needs within community develops and reinforces that social network and that social cohesion. And that volunteers play that vital resource for the nonprofit sector in being able to deliver essential services to community. I would say it's widely recognized that without volunteers, many of the community services that we enjoy or participate would not be able to be delivered in the same way without volunteers as part of that delivery system. The other part in terms of the volunteer liability is, again, the intent is really provides that broad legislative clarity and addresses a gap that currently exists. So currently, when we look at legislation, there are some or specific roles that there is legislation that provides a protection for specific individuals or specific groups of volunteers. So things like volunteer firefighters or search and rescue. Some schools have it, municipalities have it included. Alberta agricultural societies have it included, but there wasn't this broad protection that regardless of the type of organization that you were volunteering with, that provided that what we would say is good public policy and provided that scope of coverage for all volunteers, which again is the intent of the Freedom to Care Act. I think the other part of it is it demonstrates government's commitment to support and encourage volunteers, providing assurances that there is that protection from liability as long as individuals are acting in good faith, and hopefully removes any potential barriers or concerns that people have in terms of volunteering. We also know in terms of the importance of supporting volunteers is critical as a result of COVID, and that there's been growing concerns related to liability as a result of COVID. I think the other part is that from a volunteer liability protection is it really does promote that strong culture of volunteerism in Alberta that we would say is part of our cultural identity or fabric, and we want to continue to foster that. On the exemption side of things, again, I think it highlights through this legislation the important role that the nonprofit sector plays in terms of supporting Albertans as well as Alberta's recovery, that it addresses government's commitment in terms of supporting or reducing that red tape. So that is another key area. Earlier, I talked about that the sector is an economic driver in terms of the contribution that it makes to the GDP on an annual basis. And so this is one of those ways in terms of government recognizing that contribution that's made. I think it also, in terms of it provides timely and effective support in terms of exemption. So again, having a way in which we can easily be able to receive those requests from the nonprofit sector or charitable organizations and have a way in which they can be managed through government. Another benefit in terms is highlighting the importance of the sector in terms of supporting Albertans as we look at recovery. And the other one is that as we receive feedback through the survey process that was completed on Freedom to Care, is that it demonstrates the importance in terms of transparency and clarity that's available to support organizations. So one of the things that we heard from stakeholders is that government is hard to navigate. It's sometimes hard to find what you're looking for. And so when it comes to things like requesting exemptions from existing legislation, the intent of the website and the Freedom to Care in terms of the act itself is to make it easier for nonprofits to be able to provide those services and provide that, do the work that they need to do in terms of providing the supports and services to Albertans. So that's a little bit in terms of what it is and what it's intended to do as kind of the why now. Thanks, Leah.
Thanks, Anne. As Anne indicated, there's like two main components to the Freedom to Care, and I'm going to cover the first component of the Freedom to Care, the volunteer liability protection section. So the legislation includes liability protections for individual volunteers acting in the scope of their duties within reasonable exceptions. And really, the intent is to provide that broad legislative clarity, remove barriers and concerns for volunteers around liability, and balance accountability of the nonprofit sector while protecting the public. Want to highlight on the slide that first word, individual. Note that the liability protections through Freedom to Care Act are only for protecting individual volunteers, not organizations, acting within the scope of their duties. So that's the second kind of key phrase there that you'll want to kind of pay attention to, is the scope of duties. And third point there is also, whatever you're doing, it's not causing harm or damage as a result of willful, reckless, or criminal misconduct, gross negligence, operating a motor vehicle, and that's because insurance is already legally required, and being unlawfully impaired by alcohol or drugs when the harm or damage occurred. The liability protection only applies, again, as Anne had mentioned, if there's no other existing liability protection under another act, like the Municipal Governments Act or the Agricultural Societies Act. So let's dig a little bit deeper and look at what it means for volunteers. So as I mentioned before, it's underlined there, scope of duties. Volunteers at a bare minimum need to understand their scope of duties. And so within that scope of duties, the next 4 points kind of speak to that. It's ensuring they have a clear understanding of the volunteer role, duties, and tasks, that they've received the appropriate authorizations, licenses, training, or requirements for that role, to be aware of where, when, and how, and with whom this work will happen, and understand what is considered out of scope or outside the duties of their role. So sometimes people ask, well, what does a scope of duties kind of look like? It can come in the form of a job description or other document, which is supported by an orientation and may include supervisory support or a signed agreement between you and the nonprofit. On the right-hand side of the table there, it also indicates what volunteers also need to do, and that's receive all the appropriate orientation and training to perform the duties as outlined in the scope of duties, and be aware of any insurance coverage that may apply to the assigned role, and finally to be aware of any potential risks associated with the role and how to mitigate them. Often when we talk about the individual volunteers, there's two common questions that'll often come up. And the first one is, what does it mean for professionals acting in their capacity as a volunteer? So in instances of a volunteer acting in a volunteer capacity that includes a professional designation, the Act specifies that the volunteer must be properly licensed, certified, or authorized, if required by law, for the activities or practices undertaken by the volunteer in order to be protected from liability. So for example, let's say if you're a professional like a lawyer or an accountant is volunteering their professional services for a nonprofit and are licensed or registered to provide legal or financial services, then they are expected to adhere to their profession's standards, designation, and insurance and performance of their volunteer roles. Similarly, coaches, volunteer medical staff, wilderness camp leaders also need to maintain any proper licenses, certifications, and or authorization. Probably one of the most popular questions that we hear is the second one. What does it mean for directors and officers of an organization? And it's often asked by people who are sitting on as board members on an organization. So for the purposes of the Act, the definition of a volunteer is someone who is not provided compensation for their role in the nonprofit, apart from being reasonably reimbursed for their expenses. This includes directors and officers. So the Freedom to Care Act provides the broad liability protection for individual and volunteers acting within the scope of their duties on behalf of the organization, which includes directors and officers. One of the things to consider with directors and officers is that they often have a complex set of responsibilities and fiduciary duty to run an organization, and a scope of duties may not fully cover the range of responsibilities involved. So organizations need to determine if the scope of duties document will afford the proper liability protection for any of their volunteer positions, including directors and officers. An insurance agent or broker can assist organizations to determine what would be the most suitable for their unique situation. What's it mean for organizations? So it's just kind of reinforcing what I had talked about before. The broad liability protection is for individual volunteers acting in good faith, and it does not change nonprofit organizations' legal liability for any of their acts or inactions, including any liability related to their management of volunteers. The Act is not intended to cover all aspects that insurance will likely cover and specifically excludes liability protection for organizations. So if you're going to walk away from this section with some key points, it's to ensure that it covers individuals, that ensure that the scope of duties of each volunteer role is clearly and communicated and understood by the volunteer, and that assess the risks, including the risks associated with volunteer roles, which may include considerations of insurance coverage specific to that role. I really like this slide in that I would really encourage people to go on our website and check out these resources. We've developed a number of them to support the sector in implementing the volunteer liability protections. And for each of these 4 areas, we have resources that have been that are available on the website as downloadable documents. So first, scope of duties, it's a section, and it provides clarification and resources to support organizations with scope of duties. There's a checklist for volunteers to support volunteers in ensuring they have an understanding of their scope of duties. There's an excellent section around volunteer management best practices. And these links to existing volunteer management resources and best practices provide an overview and information about the bare minimum organizations need to do ensure are in place, and builds up to links and resources to support advanced volunteer management programs. So regardless of the scope and size of your organization, there is information available to support them when they are where they are at with their volunteer management. Another really good resource is the Insurance Toolkit. This toolkit assists organizations with understanding the implications of liability protections and navigating required insurance coverage. This insurance toolkit was updated from work that had been done in 2006, led by the Calgary Chamber of Voluntary Organizations, or more commonly known as CCVO, in partnership with organizations through the Alberta Voluntary Sector Insurance Council, with IBC Insurance and Volunteer Alberta. And with their permission, it is updated for now 2021. Finally, there is a volunteer liability fact sheet, and again, a downloadable resources outlining the intent and scope of the legislation. So if you go to the website and you go look for the section that's indicated or named Managing Your Volunteers and Volunteer Checklist, you can find all of these resources. I'm now going to pass it over to Leah, who will cover the second component of Freedom to Care.
Thanks, Dwayne. I'm not sure where this highlighting came from, but we have a little extra that showed up on my screen. Hopefully you're not seeing it on yours. But anyways, there's a couple points I want to make before we dig into the volunteer liability, the exemption program information, getting my sections confused. With this, it's really important to note that every organization is unique and you all have unique legal landscapes. And that means that there's different legislations that each of you are required to follow depending on the nature and type of your organization. And that because of this uniqueness, there is really no way for us to tell you which exemptions you should be looking at for your organization. Really what this is intended to do is help you become more aware of what existing exemptions are available to nonprofit organizations. And if needed, once you've reviewed those and still aren't seeing maybe what you're looking for, understand the process for how you'd go about requesting a new one. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and dive in. There's a couple key terms I want to distinguish between right now so that we can try and be clear throughout all of this. So existing exemptions means exemptions that already exist in different pieces of legislation that are available for nonprofit and charitable groups. And these are in various pieces of government legislation. And they are exemptions to regulations that are intended primarily for commercial purposes. And there was already recognition that because this legislation is intended for commercial purpose, that there needs to be a nonprofit exemption. So they've already created one. And we'll have a chance to look at what those are in a minute. The other piece is a new exemption. So a new one-time common sense exemption to regulation that is primarily intended to regulate commercial activity for nonprofit and charitable groups performing social good where no exemption exists. So basically what that means is there is no exemption at all anywhere in legislation to that specific regulation that an organization might be looking into or trying to navigate. So existing, they're already in a piece of regulation or in an act. New exemption means it doesn't exist yet and you're actually requesting a new one. So I'm going to jump into a demonstration of our website and where you go about finding these exemptions, but I want to give a little bit of context first. Through discussions with all of the government ministries, we have identified approximately 40 exemptions. Although when you go to the website, you'll see that it actually shows, I think it's 34, and that's because 7 of them have been grouped together, just because it makes more sense that way in terms of how you interpret the information. These exemptions vary from permits to food to individual liability for donating food, highway signage, private vocational training. So there's exemptions across all sorts of areas. And some of these exemptions are actually not administered or managed by the Government of Alberta. So some of these exemptions have delegated authority to municipalities. So what we've done is try and compile these exemptions in a way that A, makes them easy to find, one-stop shop to look for them, and B, tells you what you need to know about next steps. Does it have an application or permit or request process to formally get access to that exemption? Does it apply automatically, which about 14 of the exemptions do? Which ones are housed under the authority of someone outside the province, like municipalities? And so we're going to go in and I'll show you a little bit of a demonstration of the website itself, how to find things, including the volunteer liability piece. And I'll also show where the exemption inventory is and how to use that. So if you just give me a moment to pop that open, we will take a quick look at it. If it'll let me. Here we go. All right, so I'm going to step back one step here so that we can show you the whole website. So when you first come to the Freedom to Care site, it's just a quick introductory page of here's a little bit of information about the Freedom to Care. And you'll find a couple different ways to help navigate this space. So first, there's a table of contents that you can click on, and it'll let you jump to the section you're looking for. So if you want to look for an existing regulatory exemption, here's where you go. If you want to find out more about the volunteer liability piece and how to better manage your volunteers based on the new information, you can click on there and jump to that section of the website. There's also this kind of navigation page under the blue banner that also helps you pop to the different pieces that you need to find or want to find specifically. We also have a shortcut here for finding forms and documents. So if you want to download, the volunteer toolkit, insurance toolkit, you can hit the forms and documents, and it's a quick link to how to get straight to that form. So any of the resources that Dwayne had mentioned around the volunteer liability piece, the scope of duties resource, the volunteer liability fact sheet, and or fact sheets related to the exemptions, you can find all of those quick and easy in these drop down pieces, or you can navigate to those pages and you'll also find links to that content right there on that page. For the purposes of what I want to show you, I'm going to jump you right into the existing regulatory exemption and give you a little bit of information about how to use that page. So we have a bit of an overview of what these existing regulatory exemptions are. There is also a fact sheet if you need to dig into and try and pull up and recall what do these exemption means, why am I curious about them, what do I need to know about them. And then if you scroll down a little bit more, we have a searchable inventory that will help you kind of figure out what all these exemptions are. So you can filter going, hey, I have a service agreement with health. I need to know something about health, or hey, mine's food related. I think it falls under health. I'll go there. If you know kind of which ministry is responsible for legislation that you're interested in, you can search by ministry. You can also search by how you access the exemption. So if it applies automatically, if you need to contact your municipality, if it requires an application, or you can do a keyword search. So you can look up food and see if an exemption comes up under that. So if we were to pop food in there and apply filter, the site will automatically sort them and pull up the exemptions related to food. And as you can see, there's 5 different exemptions related to food. So then you can kind of dig into, and you just hit this little down arrow and it gives you a little bit more information about each of the exemptions. So you have the ministry that's responsible for it, the legislation, and where you find exactly where to find that specific exemption. So it'll give you a link and direct you to which section. It'll tell you what type of exemption it is. So does it apply automatically, or do you actually have to request it? And then there's a brief description about you know, what this exemption does, what it means in plain language, rather than trying to interpret the legalese that you would find in a regulation or in the act. And then it gives you some details around the process for how you get it. So if it applies automatically, it'll tell you that. If we look at one of these other ones that actually has a bit more process to it, or there's more to do, it again goes over the ministry responsible, where you find the legislation or the exemption that, you know, in the act or in the regulation. It gives you a description. And then here there's a process of, you know, what might happen if you're seeking this exemption, or, you know, what's the specific steps you have to take. It does give you some contact information for some of them. If there is, you know, you need to find more information or learn more about it, we've tried to include that contact information so that you can reach out directly to the ministry responsible in the program area or the department and get your answers from those who are responsible for that regulation or legislation, rather than trying to have to still search your way through or try and find, you know, who else could help you. So the intent there is that you can find and see all of the exemptions. You can look up, if you're really curious, you can read all of them. So they're all here for you to look through and determine which ones make the most sense for you, which ones do you need to learn more about, and then how do you go about accessing them or using them for the purposes of your organization. So that's the existing regulatory exemptions. So like I said, those are the ones that are already in legislation that you can go about accessing through the instructions there. So the next piece then is to talk about, oops, wrong button. Here we go, the new exemption. So my computer's not cooperating. So the legislation, what it technically did was it granted authority to cabinet through an order in council to grant a new one-time regulatory exemption. And with that power, we had to develop the process for how to actually go about making that happen. So there is now a new exemption application process where applicants will have to complete an application for an exemption, and it's submitted right online on the website, and I'll take a look at the application in a minute. Culture and Status of Women, that's what the CSW stands for, receives this application, and then we transfer or assign the application to the ministry responsible for the regulation. That ministry will review the application, assess the exemption request, and they assess it against a number of factors, which I'll share, and they'll make a recommendation as appropriate for decision. Does this go forward for a one-time exemption? Is there a reason to decline this or deny it? So it's the responsibility for the ministry who is responsible for the regulation and organization is requesting an exemption from to do that assessment. And that ministry will be the one who's responsible for preparing an order in council and getting it up to cabinet to make a decision. I do need to reiterate a few things about the new application process. It cannot be used to access an existing exemption. So if what you're looking for is in that inventory of exemptions, follow the processes for those. Do not use this new application form to try and access one of those. It's just making you do a whole bunch of work you don't need to do to access an existing exemption. So really double check that exemption inventory before you think about pursuing a new exemption. And it is really only intended in situations where nonprofit organizations identify that a regulation is making it difficult for them to do social good for public benefit. And I do want to stress that you can only request an exemption to a regulation, not to an act itself or a piece of an act itself. We do get a lot of questions around timing. And we know that organizations want to know how long this process is going to take. And unfortunately, there really is no simple answer to this question. Each exemption request will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis by the ministry responsible for the regulation, and the timelines will vary depending on the complexity of the exemption being requested. However, all of government has committed to ensuring this is a timely process, and we've put pieces in place to ensure we keep it as timely as possible. So, eligibility for requesting a new exemption. Applicants must be an incorporated nonprofit and or charitable organization that is organized and conducted for public benefit and operating primarily for charitable purposes. And I know we've gotten some questions around, what do you mean by public benefit? What do you mean by charitable purposes? And so public benefit really refers to organizations who have a mission to serve the public. They operate for the public or the good of the public and reinvest excess revenue back into meeting their mission. So examples can include most nonprofit organizations or charities. Opposed to that is what we did to call kind of member benefit, and member benefit organizations tend to have a mission focused on serving their members, and their programs, services, and resources may be restricted to members only. An example of a member benefit type organization could be a trade association, a private club, or associations whose members are primarily for-profit entities. So that is how we're kind of distinguishing what we mean by public benefit organization. And charitable purpose, it kind of covers anything that's benevolent, philanthropic, civic, educational, health, humane, welfare, religious, cultural, artistic, sport and recreation, environmental, or tourism purposes, so long as the purpose is under that not-for-profit umbrella. So that's something to note about eligibility. In terms of assessment, some of the things that each ministry will look for is, does the exemption request still align with prevailing legislation? Which means the exemption that you're requesting can't contradict or contravene the overarching legislation. We still have to follow the act, right? Because we aren't making a change to the actual legislation. The other pieces that will be assessed is the benefits, impacts, and or risks to each of these categories listed on the screen. So public health and safety obviously is very critical. We want to make sure that any exemption that's granted isn't impacting or negatively impacting public health and safety. We want to check in society and culture as a whole, public security, and we also want to see, how is this making things easier from an administrative or compliance or costs to the organization? Are there government savings that could be occurred by, allowing this exemption? And then what are some of the benefits to other organizations and or stakeholders? So those are some of the things that will be looked at if when a new application for a new exemption is received. To try and make things a little bit easier for organizations, we have created kind of a guide and things you should note or know about before you go to apply for an exemption. And we do have a limitation on our website that our application can't be saved while you're in process. So we created a Word document that allows organizations to do all their pre-work, get the right people to review it and vet it internally, and then you can just transfer that information straight back into the online application and hit submit. So I will pop up the website so we can take a look at the new exemption process. So again, we can use the table of contents, and we're going to start with applying for a regulatory exemption. So this is kind of all the background and overview documents that you can find for how to apply for a new regulatory exemption. There is a fact sheet that you can pull to make sure you really understand the purpose and intent. It goes through our eligibility and assessment factors. There's a bit of a guide, some definitions to support organizations, just so that they're really clear. Again, a reminder that before you apply, really make sure that you've checked all the content in this page, that you've looked at the existing regulatory exemption, and that you've pulled up and have accessed this application for new regulatory exemption guide and worksheet. We want to make this as simple as possible for organizations, so we have created this resource for you. It's downloadable in a Word format, so you can work on that directly. There is information about the process, and then I will pop over to what the actual application looks like online and do a quick review of kind of what's included. Again, before you apply, this big reminder, make sure you've looked at existing exemptions. We don't want you to go through all of this work if there's already a simplified process to access an existing exemption. This cannot be used to request an exemption. So there's some what it can't be used for, which we'll go into in a moment. But again, there's the worksheet and the guide, and then here's the full-on online application form. So we're going to need some general information about your organization. We want to know who you are, how you're incorporated, when your organization was incorporated, some contact information if we need to know more. Who is the primary contact for this application? So who do we reach out to if someone has additional questions and need more clarity? Who's the legal signing authority? So whoever, if the primary contact doesn't have signing authority, then who does have legal signing authority for this application? And then we're going to get into a bit of an organizational overview, because we need to understand your purpose, your mandate, who you work with, the primary services you provide, what is the public benefit that you offer. And then we need organizations to tell us which exemption, like which piece of regulation are you requesting an exemption from. So it goes into you identifying the specific piece of legislation, the regulation that you need an exemption from. These exemptions are for a limited period of time. So it's not like once you're granted one, you have it forever. It does have to be a specified period of time. So you indicate how long you would like that exemption for. You need to describe the issue or problem that the regulation is causing. We also are looking for organizations to kind of tell us how things would get better if you were granted that exemption, and then go through kind of the benefits, the impacts or risks, how you might mitigate any risks that could occur if an exemption is granted. And then to think through who are the other stakeholders who may be impacted if you are granted that exemption. And then there's just a bit of an acknowledgement piece saying that you do have the authority of your organization to submit this exemption request. And so that is the online application piece. And like I said, there is a worksheet that you can complete so that you can do all the pre-work and then just transfer it in. And it gives you a chance to think through and do your own internal assessment on all the factors that are being reviewed in order to make sure you have everything ready before you submit. So there's some things that this new application process can't do. It can't be used as an appeal mechanism for a decision on an existing exemption. So let's say that you were requesting an exemption to one of the public health exemptions that are available. There's an application process. You submit your application and you were denied. You can't use this new application process to try and appeal that. Once a decision is rendered by the ministry responsible for the existing exemptions, you'd have to go through whatever mechanisms, if any, that they have. This is not the tool to do that. This process cannot be used to request an exemption from a public health order. Public health orders are different than regulations, and this is not intended to be used and have anything to do with public health orders. And you cannot use this process to request an exemption where the regulation in question is primarily intended for the nonprofit sector. So some examples would be the Societies Act, the Libraries Act, the Agricultural Societies Act. The intent of this process is to give organizations the ability to request an exemption to a regulation that's primarily intended for commercial purposes, that's making it difficult for them to do social good. It's not meant to exempt you from the legislation that you are actually incorporated under or are required to follow it because it's a nonprofit related regulation or legislation. In addition to the processes and all the tools and resources that have been posted online, Culture and Status of Women have also created some navigational support that is intended to assist organizations if they're not quite getting what they need out of all the web content and web information that's available. So we do have a contact us form on the page. It's right at the top. There's a quick, simple submit a question kind of piece, and it gets submitted directly to Culture and Status of Women staff. And the staff who receive that will categorize any inquiries into like 3 tiers. So tier 1, it's really about inquiries submitted through the Freedom to Care website that aren't exemption related. So they could be exemptions about volunteer liability protections, questions about that, how to make sense of something like that. And or if we do receive questions that aren't really related to either volunteer liability protection or the exemptions, we also try and help navigate those to the best of our ability. And those are handled internally by Culture and Status Women staff. Then there are tier 2 exemptions. So those are any questions that we might get about an existing exemption. So you've gone through the inventory of existing exemptions. Maybe there's still a question. It's not quite clear yet, you know, if you're understanding it properly. And so if we receive an inquiry about that, the staff here at Culture and Status Women will provide that navigational support to connect you, the requester, to the ministry responsible as quickly and as seamlessly as possible. We really want to get organizations to the person or the people that can answer your questions. And so we do provide kind of that back-end navigational support to create that connection. And then for tier 3, those are any inquiries we get about an exemption that doesn't exist, so that new exemption process. So those, if we receive an application, obviously it goes through the process that I outlined, where we receive it, assign it to the ministry responsible, and then that ministry takes appropriate action. If it's a question about the new exemption process, so you're not quite clear or you're not sure if you're understanding the new exemption process, if a question is received around that, then Culture and Status of Women will do their best to respond to that question and create that clarity for organizations. So in addition to what we believe is a very useful and very easy to navigate website, we also have this navigation support that's really intended to address the needs that we heard about how difficult it is for the sector to navigate government. So maybe you're wondering, like, so what? Why is all of this important? Why did I just give up an hour of my time to attend this webinar? Well, really, the result of this act and the associated government programming is there's now this centralized inventory and website for existing exemptions. This did not exist before, and if you were looking for an exemption, you may have had to filter through and try and review hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of legislation to try and find the piece that you were looking for. So with this initiative, we now have all of those existing exemptions in an easy to find, easy navigate space that you can just go through what's available. We also have this assistant with for navigating these existing exemptions. So if what's in that inventory isn't clear, then there is someone who can assist you with figuring out who you need to talk to. We now have this new process, which did not exist before this legislation, where nonprofit organizations can request a new exemption to a regulation where it may not already exist. And then we have these volunteer liability protections, which is really good public policy, right? It's intended to foster volunteerism and to address some of the concerns that we're hearing about the risks associated with volunteerism, especially in this state of the pandemic that we're in. But not only that, we've also got the resources to support organizations to understand the protections and the volunteer management best practices. And they're on the website, they're available in easy to download documents where you can take that and look at your organization and say, you know, what volunteer management best practices suit where we are and the type of organization we are, and how do we build up and expand our volunteer management processes as we grow and expand as an organization. So with that, we'd love to open it up to questions that have come in the chat box. If you have been holding your questions, please feel free right now to pop those into the chat box, and myself and my colleagues will do our best to respond to those questions. And maybe Sherry, if you want to go ahead and let us know what's come in so far.
A first one just arrived.
Perfect.
So the question is, how does this fit into liability coverage that is currently obtained through another source? For example, as a provincial sports organization, our national sport organization provides liability for our board members and volunteers. Would liability be complementary, or would one take precedence over the other?
And did you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure, thank you. So great question. And again, when we look at it through the lens of good public policy, as we would say, this is the base level of protection for everyone. So if there are organizations, and again, I think national bodies is a great example, is that if there was something to happen, is I think we would see that layered kind of effect in terms of what's the base level, what additional insurance does either the organization have, whether it's at a provincial or at that national level. So I'm not really sure that I would say one would take precedent over the other. And again, the question or the response that we often hear is that the lawyers would probably say it would depend in terms of what that individual situation was. So if there already is protection that is provided national, I think this just adds that other layer of kind of broad protection for all of the volunteers. I think the other part in terms of sport that we would see in terms of, organizations making sure that they have the right protection depending on what those roles are that volunteers have. And so sport is a great example of they've ensured that there is the appropriate amount of coverage, whether it's for coaches or officials or others that are involved in the organization. So it is again, it's a hard question. I would say it's worthwhile to let your national sport organization know that the coverage is provided, but it's probably not necessarily going to change the policy that they have.
Another question. What is the process or who deals with a situation when a volunteer chair's intent is to cause harm, does not act in good faith, threatens, abusive, harms the nonprofit for plus 10 years? This is a hard question. Is not active, is not engaged, is not knowledgeable on internal nor external legislation, and cares less about nonprofit best practice.
So I'll maybe respond to that one as well. It does sound like that is a situation in which your organization will need to determine if you need legal advice to support it. And probably not something that that we would be able to address at this level. Again, I think it's one of those certain circumstances. So you have a situation that your organization may need to look at. From our perspective, the intent, if something was to happen where there was a case in front of the courts and they were determining who is liable for actions or course of action that was taken, is that this broad level of volunteer liability protection is meant to be that base. And then depending on the circumstances and if there was something willfully done, that is the courts to determine. And again, I think that's the part where Leah said is that we are not lawyers and able to offer that legal advice. So situations like that, we would refer you to seek legal advice in terms of how your organization might deal with it.
I do have a third question, which relates to the scope of the Freedom to Care Act. And it includes an acronym that I'm not sure what it stands for. So I was using the website and couldn't find anything about CASL regulations. So I assume the website regulations are restricted to provincial ones. So it's maybe asking about a Canadian, maybe the C stands for Canadian level, but it's that, yeah, the restrictions are focused on provincial.
Yeah, so the regulatory exemptions that are listed in our exemption inventory are all those under legislation available under the Alberta government. So it's Alberta law. There isn't anything listed there for acts that may be Canadian or federal in nature.
Oh, the CASL stands for the Canadian Anti-Spam Legislation.
Yeah, no, this doesn't include anything specific to Canadian legislation at all.
And it looks like that's all the questions so far.
I do have one that came in directly to me. So the question is, does this exemption process apply to a social activity provided or facilitated by nonprofit organizations to members and the general public, not a charitable activity? So I think what you're trying to get at is kind of that definition of public benefit versus member benefit, if I'm interpreting that correctly. And really the exemption, it's viewed on a case-by-case basis. So depending on which exemption or regulation you're requesting an exemption from, and the purposes for the regulation and why you want the exemption and what your organization does and who they work with, all of those things are assessed to determine whether or not a regulation, an exemption would be granted for that regulation. So in this case, I can't give a yes or no answer. It, again, as Anne said, it'll fall into that it depends on the circumstances, the scenario, who your organization is, you know, what you're trying to do, and which exemption you're requesting, which regulation you're requesting an exemption from in the case of when you're applying for a new regulatory exemption. If it falls under one of those existing exemptions, you just have to go through the process listed for an existing exemption to determine whether or not that exemption would be apply for your situation and or contact the ministry responsible.
Another question has come in. Do you see this as sufficient liability coverage for a stewardship association?
Yeah, so again, I think that's another one of the depends. I think that's the conversation to have with your insurance broker, indicating, and you know, in terms of here's what we currently have for insurance. This is the activities that our organization is involved in, and does this, you know, kind of again broad protection provide what your organization would need. It goes back to the comment that we made at the beginning, is that recognizing the diversity of our nonprofit sector, the fact that we have 26,000 plus nonprofits, some that are solely ran by volunteers and other ones that are large multi-million-dollar organizations that employ thousands of staff, is that it really will vary on a case-by-case basis. So your organization, we would encourage you to have conversations with your broker to see what insurance coverage you currently have, and is it suffice to cover the level of activities or responsibilities that your organizations have.
I saw that Leah put in the chat box a link to the website, as well as a note that the recording of this webinar will be made available on the Freedom to Care website, which is, just want to highlight that. Or Leah, if you want to speak as well. Yeah. Somebody's just asked if the toolbox and presentation and resources will be available, or how it'll be available.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything that we mentioned today is on the Freedom to Care website. All of those toolkits, all of that stuff is there and made available, and I can, you know, kind of walk you through it again. We've got, you know, right from the table of contents, you can go to managing your volunteers and you can look up all the resources that are there. So really, the thing you want to take away is the Freedom to Care website, which is alberta.ca/freedom to care. Or if you just search Freedom to Care Alberta, it'll take you directly to our website, and so you can navigate around there. The recording will also be posted on the website, so once we've had a chance to do what we need to do to get it ready to post, it will be embedded right in the website. So if you need to go back through and listen to pieces of what we shared to deepen your understanding, that will be made available right directly on the website. So you're better off just to go directly to the website. We really did build this website to be a self-service model website. We wanted to make it absolutely easy as possible for organizations to find what they're looking for, so they don't have to keep a copy of the slide deck and try and remember the links. Everything is right there available to you. You just have to kind of take a few minutes to navigate yourself through what all the different pieces of the website are.
Next one I'll address back to Anne, just a further follow-up from the earlier question about, so you had referenced about taking it up in the court or approaching legal advice when a director is not operating in the best interest of the organization. So the questions are who takes it up in the court, who would pay, what ministry would address this, and a comment that there needs to be an ombudsman or mediator or management organization that deals with this, or who senior staff can go to when harmed.
Yeah. Definitely not an easy question. So anything that happens in the court is that, again, that would be at that organizational level. So whether it's somebody within the organization that feels that they have been harmed or affected, then they're the ones that are pursuing it. This legislation does not have anything to do with how you might access the judicial system or taking a case to court. That is outside. This is solely meant to, again, from a good public policy, is to provide that base level of protection for all organizations, for all volunteers. So it's not staff, it's not organizations. It is only for volunteers that are part of those organizations that are acting within the scope of their duties. And if there was something tragic that happened and an individual felt that they were harmed, is they have the ability to go to the courts and use the justice system to be able to do that. But we have nothing with that process. And there is, in terms of the ombudsman, again, that process for nonprofit organizations, it is at an individual level for them to determine that. There isn't anything that we're able to offer at a provincial level in that respect.
And a final question, is it fair to say that this was not meant to replace directors and officers insurance?
Again, I think that will be another depends situation. So it will, it goes back to kind of that we're a steward organization. Depending on the scope of responsibilities that your organization is responsible for. And I think about some of our smaller nonprofit organizations, maybe they host events or run a program, maybe they don't, but it's all ran by volunteers. Is that the only insurance that you may have at this time is the directors and officers insurance? You may find that this base level of protection is all that you need. If you're, again, it will depend on your organization. If your organization is still all ran by volunteers, but you're responsible for hosting large events or providing a number of programs, you may find that you want additional coverage. And again, that will be a case by case. Those are conversations we would encourage you to have with your insurance broker.
Yeah, and to add to that, it's about doing your own organizational risk assessment. What are our risks? How are we, mitigating these risks? What are the tools we need to use? And insurance being one of them. So it's a chance to assess that. And if you need to do a deeper dive, then the insurance brokers, especially those who specialize in nonprofit, can help you navigate that conversation and determine which tools are best for your organization.
And I think your comment, Leah, responds well to the next question as well. Looking at the insurance toolkit, is each organization responsible for applying for their own liability insurance with an approved broker, and who pays for this?
So organizations are responsible for assessing their risks and determining how they're going to mitigate them, and that may include investing in and purchasing liability coverage for different, depending on your program, services, or offerings. So it is at that organizational level that you have to determine what do we need, and then how do we go about paying for it. So the insurance toolkit, while it does help organizations determine and understand what these liability protections mean, it is also a great resource for just helping organizations think through their insurance requirements as a whole, right? It is really a broad toolkit that helps organizations go through different aspects of their operations and kind of look at how are we managing this through an insurance lens, if that is the appropriate tool. But any of this is really at an organizational level. What do you need, and then how do you go about securing it and purchasing it?
And unless Justin has anything further, I think that covers all the questions that have come in.
If that is everything, then we give you the gift of time. We weren't sure how long the question and answer would go, so we booked a little extra time. And we do thank you for joining us today, for your great questions, for taking the time to learn about this new resource that's available to the sector. And we do ask that feel free to share the website link and tell people that this is available to them. We do want nonprofits to know that this is a new resource, new liability coverage that is there for their volunteers and to help support and augment their volunteer management practices, as well as helping a little bit with that navigating government and making it slightly easier for the sector as a whole to find some of this information that they may not have known was available to them in the past.
So with that, I too thank everyone. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.